Welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and the producer of this podcast, Sarah Tori. In this session, I spoke with my guest, Jaroslav Schnaubert, a software developer and the lead developer at the company Assist, about some of the challenges the newcomers might face when they first start using Axon Framework, and understanding some of the patterns that sometimes go along with it, such as domain-driven design, CQRS, and so on. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jaroslav, and let's have a listen. Hi, Jaroslav. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you could please tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, and maybe where you're located.
So, hello everybody. My name is Jaroslav and I'm from Prague. I work with a company called Assist and we cooperate with Renault on our projects. And I have been working with the Axon framework for 3 years, if I'm correct, maybe already 4 years. I'm not sure right now.
Wonderful. And then we had a chat a little bit after our conference last year in September when we met up in Amsterdam. And you and Richard had a really wonderful presentation on the journey you've taken in collaborating with Renault in one of their main projects, basically, which has a lot of traffic, and it was an old application. You brought it up to modern days, which is really great. So one of the points that you had mentioned was regarding this kind of learning curve, not just when it comes to Axon framework, for instance, or any kind of framework for that matter, but more so in regards to the patterns that we talk about a lot of times. A lot of people are concerned about some of these patterns. Some of them are not really new. For example, domain-driven design is one of the patterns that a lot of times is talked about. That's at this point is over 20 years old, but still is not really used to its full potential a lot of times, but also with some of the other patterns, like, separating commands and query sides of things and so on. You had some really good examples with some of the new engineers that come to your team, and also with yourself when you took on this project. What were some of the challenges for you to grasp all of this information without really feeling overwhelmed?
That's a good question. Well, I think that the main problem is that everybody today, or most of the people, not everybody, of course, is using CRUD. Every course you take related to the beginnings to the development, everything is using the CRUD approach, how to modify the data. For example, you're learning how to use Spring repositories, and well, you're using CRUD in these tutorials. It's the same at the universities, and I think it's actually for the beginners it's hard to learn CQRS if you don't specifically search CQRS.
Gotcha.
This may be a main problem.
So, how did you come across it? Was it because you were involved in this project, and your colleague Richard, who's I believe he's the CTO of Assist?
Yes,
Am I
yes, he's
correct?
CTO.
Yeah, yeah. So, was it because of him, or had you heard of these terms before?
It was actually because of him, or maybe because other application which we already written in Axon framework, it was using only the framework, not the server.
Mm.
And by the time I was in Assist for like a month maybe, and we had a new project, and Richard told me, why don't you do it with the Axon framework? And I said, okay, well, yeah, I will take a look. And I, I quite found nice the idea because Richard is
Yeah.
our main architect. Don't get me wrong.
Right. 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 Yeah. But was it so you found the idea nice? When you
Mhm.
look at it in terms of um, sort of just theoretically, right? It seems nice. You have your commands, you do your logic or the decision
Mhm.
making part of the application on one side, and then you're not dealing with the data retrieval or anything on the same side. You have it on another location, right? Within the same application. So that sounds really nice, theoretically. But then, how was it practically for you?
Well, of course, it was hard to start with the Axon framework, and I see that for all beginners in our or newcomers in our project, they really struggle with several things. So first of all, it was understanding the concept of DDD. Let's say, mainly what
Hmm.
exactly is the aggregate and why do you actually need projections? This was the first problem. I think it's the problem for every newcomer in this concept to understand why actually do you need projection? Why do you actually build many projections for the same data? Like you have, for example, two pages in your application, each is using slightly different view, and you have two projections, one per each of these pages. So
Yes,
I,
that was the issue for me as well to
uh,
understand. Yeah, when I
yes,
first
yes.
came in, it's like, why? So then how do you explain that why? That's a good why. How do you explain it though?
Well, how to explain this? This is really a good question. Well, firstly, I explain what exactly is the aggregate, and then I proceed with the projections. So
Hmm.
the aggregate is like a source, one single source of root on which you perform the updates or,
Hmm.
well, the commands. I often compare it, as I mentioned on the conference, I compare it to a house from Lego bricks where you have some events. One event is the Lego brick, and as you put them one by one, you are building your Lego house.
Hmm.
So this is the aggregate for me. And then we have the projection. It's like a point of view on the given aggregate. So, or not only one aggregate, you can put several aggregates in the projection. It really depends on what you are building. Oftenly, you have like one aggregate per, let's say, entity. And then you have projection where you are actually holding all the entities and you are looking at them. I
Hmm.
don't have a practical example for projections. Sorry.
No, that's okay. This is a really good example, actually, with the Lego bricks, because I think most of us have the experience of playing with Legos, and you put the
Hmm.
Legos on top of each other to build a structure, and it's sort of similarly to what you explained with events. You can't really go in and grab one of the bricks from the bottom of your structure because everything else is going to collapse, right? So you do
Yes,
have to be
exactly.
mindful of what goes on top of what. That way, if you do need to make adjustments, it's not going to collapse your entire structure, your house or building, whatever you were creating. Yeah, I daily on a daily basis I step on Legos because my boys are obsessed with Lego creation. So it's just yeah, feels like home to me, this example. So going a little bit back to what you had mentioned with aggregates, so you said you usually explain the need for various projections through explaining what an aggregate is. Now, in the past year or so, we've also toyed around with the idea of not using an aggregate or not putting everything in a
Hmm.
boundary of aggregates, right? Because it does make it a little bit difficult to do those adjustments, right? Because when you have an aggregate, everything has to happen in one go, right? And from the outside, it's an atomic change. So, looking at an aggregate itself, would you say now that we have talked about these various changes and maybe aggregate is not really needed, maybe you
Hmm.
could just have message handler classes or so on. Which way would you recommend? Would you say let's not bound yourself to the boundaries of an aggregate and be a little bit more flexible, or how would you go about it?
Definitely, I prefer flexibility. If you are asking this question, because we are just facing this issue in our current implementation. Basically, what I can say that we are developing something like an e-shop where you have a basket, and
Mhm.
we had a feature that you can upload external basket from different application, and then you can assign it to your basket. So basically, you have to aggregate, and we faced an issue that if when you want to assign the baskets together, you have to actually fire two events because you have
Mhm.
to completely separate aggregate. So I
Yeah.
definitely prefer the flexibility to only throw one event because basically it's a duplicate.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So in this case, in your particular example, when you're firing two events, um, does it then interfere one with the other, or how do you then process it after that?
This may be a bit complicated to explain because we are using sagas, but not Axon sagas. We have
That's where I was headed to, but
identified,
it's good that you're not
yeah.
using Axon sagas because now I'm more interested.
We actually used Axon sagas, but not. We do not define the saga the same way like Axon framework does. We have
Okay.
identified several patterns in our applications. Of course, command and queries. This is straightforward, I think. But as well, we have defined sagas and processes. Basically,
Hmm.
with saga, we call everything that is synchronous, and with process, we call everything that is asynchronous. Yeah,
Okay.
for
Okay.
example, asynchronous, I mean that, I don't know, somebody orders something and you are waiting for the payment, let's say.
Hmm.
That can be an
Yeah.
example. And with synchronous, actually, we are doing these assigns with the baskets, for example. So we have a saga, which is triggered by a command. This command is not bounded to any aggregate at all. It has
Hmm.
some static ID, and we have a command handler not in an aggregate, but basically in a Spring Boot service.
Hmm.
Then we start handle the command. We check status in the external basket whether it is assigned or not, and if not, we send a command which is like, which states like assigning is in progress or it has been assigned, let's say. Then we send another command to the standard basket, and once everything is done, we verify the result. And if there was happened anything badly, if there was any bad result, we send another command to the first basket, to the external one, which where we say that it was not possible to assign this external basket to the user's basket, and we send another
Hmm.
event that the basket is, let's say, assignable.
Gotcha. So then that Spring Boot service that you're using, that's basically your process manager, which acts as your asynchronous
Yes,
saga.
exactly.
Gotcha. So just by listening to you explaining this for a minute, it does seem very complex. So of course, that flexibility can very much come in handy, right? Um,
Yes, yes.
so that's one of the I think that's one of the things that it is confusing for newcomers when they come in with this idea of projections, and why do you need to have these projections, and also what kind of events do you need to store? Because
Mm,
a lot of times we've had this question, and I can't remember if you were part of some of the discussions the day before the conference, but there was a lot of confusion, and also many questions that were asked about how do you define what goes into an event and what gets stored, right? An example of it
yes.
was one person asked for uh, what if my user's email address changes and I can't update, I can't delete, right? You can't use crud. So what do I do with this? I don't want to have this event constantly stored with an old email address and then publish a new event with a new email address. So those were some of the questions that were asked. So how do you tackle those decision, I guess, that decision making part of this process?
So you mean how we approach to modeling of aggregates?
Modeling the aggregates, and also really understanding which events are being stored and what actually goes into that event, what information is stored within an event.
So this is where the DDD comes in, because we try to speak with the business as much as possible in order to understand how the application behaves. And then once we are feeling that we understand this, we actually start with the modeling of the events and commands. Once we have the events and commands, somebody does the review. I do the review. And then
Yeah.
once it's clear to everybody, we start with the implementation of exact callings of these commands, of firing of these events, and etc. So
Mhm.
firstly, we begin with the discussion with the business. Then we design the events and the commands, which are changing the data, and then we
Mhm.
proceed with the rest. And I liked your example with, for example, changing of the email address. The email address isn't just changed; it's changed based on some event. For
Mhm.
example, a user updated his own email address in some settings or something. So this has to be an event, and of course, your old event, or sorry, your old event will be stored somewhere in the event store. However, you have an event that will override this email later. So everything
Mhm.
is in the history.
Yeah. Gotcha. And that's an important part to mention because everything goes into the history and you're not losing anything, right? And we see real examples of that as well. For example, if somebody has a name change or something like that, you want to still be able to keep the history of what their previous name was and now what they go by, right? And that's important because then you're not running into a situation where you're missing that part of information and then you don't know exactly if this is the real person that you were you were communicating
Hmm.
with a year ago and now they have maybe a different last name or what have you. So those are good examples. One thing
And
that
maybe,
you mentioned that I
sorry for
yeah, go ahead,
sorry
go
for
ahead.
jumping in.
No, no,
Maybe
please.
this is also a good example of the projections because it really, the building of the projection depends on what actually kind of data do you want to keep in the projections.
Hmm.
Do you care about the actual data which are, let's say, real time right now? For example, you can have some table with users and then you can find his email address. Okay, you take his email address, you send the email. Or for example, you can see some history of the user changes, for example, all his previous emails. Okay, you have a projection where you keep all his emails as a list, for example. So
Hmm.
this may be a
Yeah,
good
that
example.
is a very good example. And I want to touch on a couple of things too. um so the example that you gave right now is really great because part of it also goes back to what are you trying to define in your business, right? What is the problem you're trying to solve and which context you're in, right? Because we're now talking
Mhm.
about a person and that person's personal information might change, and that might be in one context where it has its own projections and deals with its own set of questions and problems it has to solve, right? And then you may have in another context this same person, but you don't care about their personal information. Maybe you only care about their bank account history or something like that, right? So
Mhm.
those are really important things to consider, as well as what goes into your projection based on what kind of business problems you're trying to solve.
Exactly.
One thing you mentioned, which I love, and I want to repeat that, if I may, you said you go to business, you have a conversation with the business side to really understand their requirements, and then you start designing your commands and events and so on. Do you use a process such as event storming or event modeling, or how do you
Mhm.
organize that conversation?
We tried to use this from the start, but
I love the tried. We tried
yeah.
it. I'm assuming it wasn't successful, but tell me
Yes,
more.
yes, it wasn't successful, unfortunately, because we were
Yeah.
trying to put everything together along with the business. But
Mm,
later then we have started like analyzing the tickets on our own, and then come back to the business with questions, actually whether we understand correctly the behavior, and from this we are putting the commands and the events together.
mhm.
So basically, there is
So,
still some confirmation from the business, but
right.
we do it a different way.
You don't all huddle in the same room and then hash out the details. So then tell me what was not successful. Why wasn't it successful when you were trying to sit together and find out what are the points that you really have to discuss and what is that ubiquitous language going to be?
Well, I think it mostly the main problem was that it was really time consuming, and
Mm,
the long meetings, everybody is not able to pay attention for the whole meeting. So we like
right.
splitted it into the smaller pieces. So we have like 8 developers, including me in the team. So everybody has his own US. He splits
Mm,
US on his own, then he confirms it with the business, and then he develops it. So it's not like
mhm.
one day lasting meeting, but it's
Right.
it's like basically several smaller calls.
Yes, yeah, that makes it a lot easier because we all know how much we love meetings, especially long
Yeah.
ones. Yeah, so that's a really good thing to also keep in mind. If you want to do those sessions, maybe break them up. And so you mentioned that maybe one person who's working on one aspect of it, then they go to business and ask a question, and then you are the person who then at the end of it comes in and reviews everything to make sure that everybody's basically on the same page before
Yes,
proceeding
yes.
with coding, right? Yeah. You have the fun
Yes,
job then.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, the code I am basically doing. I'm not developing right now. I'm mostly
Mhm.
code reviewing, but really, I don't
Yes.
mind. I don't mind.
Yeah.
I'm
Oh, that's
uh,
good. That's good.
I'm basically the validator of the ubiquitous language. I am, let's say, validating that everything is named as it should be, and
Mm-hmm.
these things. Because
Because
of
we
course,
know
as you know,
naming is the most important
yeah.
thing, right?
And once you
Yes.
put the event in the event store, you cannot rename it, or you can. There are possibilities, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Sure. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So,
Um, yeah, and of course you have to be careful with those things, right? Because anytime you change something in your
mhm.
event store, of course you're not really changing the history, but you do want to be mindful of what's happening. Unless you do
Well,
event
it's a bit
transformation, then that's a
problem.
little bit tricky,
Yeah,
right?
it's a bit problem if you want to do some refactoring, which includes changing of data structures.
Hmm.
However, I think this is an obstacle that you have to count with when you come to this paradigm. Once you have something in history, it's unchangeable.
Hmm. Hmm. And you just kind of make peace with it, right? You may not love it, but
Yes,
it's,
yes.
if you want to have a really accurate log of what has happened, and you want to be able to go back and really in detail find out how things got to where they are. I think that's an important one to consider.
Well, basically,
And of
there are
course,
some
yeah.
ways how to perform these updates. For example, if you want to rename a field, there are ways how to work with the JSON serializer. If you are actually working with JSONs, of course, that depends,
Mhm.
because as everybody knows, XML is for some reason default, which
Right.
is a bit unpleasant.
Yes.
For example, you can have a setter which has the old name, and then you assign it to the new name value. So there are ways how to bypass some issues, but of course,
Mhm.
renaming of the event can be tricky, or moving it to
Yeah.
different package. We have actually implemented a solution where we don't have a package related naming convention of events. So we don't store com dot something dot something dot event name. We just fill in the event name. But of course, there was a tricky implementation in order to achieve this.
Yes. So there was, you had to put some magic into it, and so to speak, to make it happen. So one of the things that we also discussed a little bit was not just the understanding of the ideas and patterns and really mentally get used to that, but also when it comes down to Axon framework specifically, some of the annotations that were a bit confusing. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, yes. I remember one colleague which was really, for some reason, struggling with event handler and event sourcing handler. I was
He
really
was not
trying hard to
alone. We have a
explain.
lot.
Yeah.
Yes.
The difference between the event sourcing and event handling, it was really hard to explain. He was a Czech as well, but I had to explain to him a bit using in English, because the event sourcing,
Mm,
that you are sourcing the aggregate, you are like
yeah.
building your aggregate from the scratch, and then event
Hmm.
handling, that you are handling the event. So we had to use English for the explanation, not Czech, because in Czech it's of course completely different. But
That
yeah.
is so interesting. I had never thought about that. That's really interesting. I'm so glad you mentioned that though, because that's something that we do have to take into consideration, because things in language are, they mean different things, and sometimes in translation they may get lost. So that's very interesting you mentioned that. And I do say that it's it wasn't just your colleague who has this kind of problem. We've had a lot of
Mhm.
questions about that, and you're absolutely right. So functionally, like when it comes down to it, they do essentially the same thing, so they're not different from each other when it comes to if you're going down technical aspects of it. But you're absolutely right. And one thing that because I do these intro webinars regularly, and I've been doing them for a while, and I have made a point of mentioning it during those webinars, and I'm glad you brought this up, because I can now say it again. The event sourcing handler, as you mentioned correctly, it goes under the aggregate, and it sources your event. So if you are doing event sourcing, that is an annotation you want to use. If you're not using event sourcing, then don't even worry about it, right? Um, so that goes on the command side of your application, on the right side of the application. So you have, for instance, your annotated aggregate at aggregate, which is basically a Spring annotation. Then you have your aggregate identifier, then you have your at command handler, and then at the bottom of the page, basically, if you like to
You have the
organize it
magic,
like I
yes.
do, you have the event sourcing handler. And then event handlers actually happen on the projection side of your application. So on the query side of the application, you have your event handlers, and those are the handlers that deal with the events. So that's I'm so glad you brought that up. That's always asked. So what are some of the other things that you came across and you had issues with?
Well, speaking of the Saga annotation, this is often a huge problem for us because, as we mentioned at somewhere in the middle of, of our talk,
Yeah.
we call Saga something different that is in Axon because, well, it should be a process in Axon. And
Yes.
I think I spoke with somebody from your team, and he mentioned that it will be renamed actually to the process in version 5, but I'm not 100% sure, of
Yeah,
course.
we've talked about it for years. It's supposed to be changed to Process Manager, and hopefully, Axon Framework 5 will make that happen. Yeah, it's confusing, and I completely understand because Saga
I'm looking
historically
forward.
means
I'm looking
different as
forward
well.
for I'm really looking forward for the refactoring once we will doing the upgrade. To rename everything to correct value.
Yes, yes, yes. No, I understand, and yes, rest assured, there are constant conversations happening, and as we speak, they're really working on it to make it even better and more clear for everybody so that you don't run into some of these issues. So that's really really great feedback, first of all, thank you. And it's also really wonderful to see that you are enjoying it, but we're not also making it all rainbows and butterflies, because it never is, right? um, and we are striving to make it better every day, and hopefully we'll get there. But it's also really great to see that it's actually helping some of these projects that you've come across, and it's made life maybe not at the beginning easier, but as you get more used to it and work with it, it does get easier. So have you felt that these uh, use of the framework or patterns, or maybe some of these design sessions that you've had with your team, has helped you in the end with your projects? Because obviously, which we've talked about, the learning curve is a bit high, and
Mhm.
it might be exhausting sometimes. But have you come to a place where you feel like this actually really helped? This made my life
Yes,
easier.
definitely. Definitely, I have this opinion for a very long time, maybe almost since the beginning of the project, because actually in the microservice world, always the biggest pain is how the services should communicate together. Mostly
Hmm.
you bound to the rest, and of course, yeah, there goes the issues. But with the framework,
What
this
can
is
go
really easy
wrong?
to handle.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. What can go wrong? I remember that we had a session with Frederick and we were discussing an architecture of one application which is communicating in micros with REST,
Hmm.
bounded to all microservices, and we have draw some nice satanic circle how everything is communicating in everything.
It was a
Yeah, but
spaghetti mess, wasn't it?
yeah, yeah, definitely it was a large spaghetti. So actually, I like the project or the product which is Axon framework, but what I appreciate mostly is the Axon server. This is the gold which I can see that is developed because it handles really many things: the routing, the registration of the connected clients, and this is where I mainly see the added value.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more. Why is that so valuable to you? Obviously, I mean, you mentioned a couple of things, but where is it the point that you say, I really can see the value in this, as opposed to if you were using other services or databases?
Mhm, mhm. Well, for example, if you want to add one new microservice, basically you everything you had to do is to fill in correct configuration. Then you have prepared your application. You register some new query handler, some command handler, and that's basically everything what you do. You don't have to do any further registration. Maybe in Axon Server you have to register your tokens, but that's
Hmm.
basically everything.
That's pretty much it.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and I really love this idea. What I
And that's
really like as well is actually the routing that You just fire a command and the Axon server points it to the correct handler. You don't specify
Hmm.
anything like where you are sending it. Axon server just grabs it and sends it to a correct client.
Yeah, and that's something that we also have seen a lot of people enjoying that, which is important, right? Because that's the whole idea. You want to. That's part of the that is the location transparency that we
Yes,
oftentimes
yes.
talk about, right? You really need to know where things are going to, as long as they are handled by the correct receivers, basically, right? Um, and that is extremely powerful, and also makes the life of the developer or somebody in the ops
Mm.
team even much easier, because you don't have to
Yes,
worry
yes,
about all the
definitely.
nitty gritties. And that's
You
something
don't
that
have
you
to.
mentioned that yeah, I'm sorry to
Sorry,
cut you
sorry.
off, but I also really appreciated the fact that you said it's it's based on messages. You're not using REST API or anything like that. So you just, if you're, let's say, creating a new microservice in your system, or maybe you're bringing a part of your application out of your monolith and making it into your its own module, for example, you reroute the messages and the work is more or less done, right? So that makes it easier as well.
Mm. Yes,
Really
exactly.
great.
You
Yeah,
don't have
I'm
to
sorry,
bound
you were gonna
any
mention
static
another thing.
address. You don't have to
Yeah.
bound any static REST address anywhere. You just send a command and that's basically everything. And I
Mm.
really like this idea. And speaking of location transparency, this also makes us sleep better because we know that, for example, if one day we need to go worldwide, we just simply start an instance in America or
Hmm.
Australia and connect it to the Axon cluster. Then we start some local microservices there, and that's basically everything what we need to do. And
Yeah,
this
and
is
I
an
love
idea
that
which
you
I
mentioned
really like.
that. Yes, yeah, I love that you mentioned that. It can be multi-zoned. You don't need to know exactly how it's connected. It does get connected to where you want it to go, which is awesome. For the interest of time, is there anything else you want to mention? I know we talked a lot about a lot of things, and maybe we'll come back and talk more in detail about some of those points. Anything else though for this portion that you think might be useful for somebody who's a newcomer?
Hmm. It's a good question. I don't have prepared any answer.
That's okay. All of the above. Or maybe just read about it, right? Maybe just kind of do a little bit of exploring and experimenting and
Mm,
see what works
definitely.
for everybody. Yeah.
Read some basics of CQRS and event sourcing, what and actually why it's so useful to do it, and definitely don't ignore DDD part because this is maybe more important than the whole CQRS and event sourcing, I think. To
Mm,
have the
yeah.
ubiquitous language to speak with the business so you understand each other. This
Right.
is
Right.
the most precious thing the most precious thing
That's
I think.
that's really important, and I'm so happy you mentioned this, because I think we do talk a lot about why is it difficult to be in a microservices world, right? If you have an application, for example, that uses various modules, or if you have various applications within your systems, the most difficult thing is the communication part, right? That's the whole idea that we're trying to make better, right? And to improve on, because communicating within your microservices can be really messy. And I think
Yes.
in our lives as human beings, that is also a huge problem, right? Communication is the key to succeed or fail a lot of times. And what you mentioned now, I think, is really really important. And I think if I would take one takeaway out of this conversation, would be communicate with your business side as well, because you have to be on the same page. You have to be able to
Mhm.
speak the same language. If you have two
Yes,
different names for the same thing, it will cause a lot of problems in the end. So I
definitely,
appreciate you
definitely.
mentioning that.
And of course, how you would like to model something, some event, if you don't actually know the intention of the event. What does it actually mean?
Hmm. Hmm. And I think
This
that's
is
important, the
often a pain.
intention. Yes,
Yes,
absolutely.
yes.
The intention is absolutely important, because that's basically what drives. that decision making part of your application to basically be delivered, right, and be done correctly. Absolutely, very nice. Thank you so much. This was such a it was a quick conversation, but there was a lot that happened. I really appreciate your time, and really thank you for answering to all of my questions. I put you on the spot a lot, and you gave me wonderful answers to all of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed my talk with Jaroslav. Please join me next time as I speak with other wonderful guests about amazing topics. Until then, have a great time and happy coding.